Hello. Thank you so much. Welcome to the second morning session. Our first speaker is Professor Xenophon Moussas. No introduction is necessary. You heard him in the morning. And he will talk to us about the optics in Hellenistic Alexandria and the case of the pharaohs. We look forward to it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yes, there are very many aspects of the technology at Hellenistic times. And surprisingly enough, optics was a very important part of science at the time. Oh, it seems that. And of course, the pharaohs, that is one of the seven wonders, has to enter into optics, as it is believed that it had some optical components, as we see in this beautiful fierce drawing that he did 100 years ago. And there are some small bits and pieces here and there describing the optics of the system, like this one by Al-Muqaddisi, who says that there was a system at the top of the building that enables the observers to see vessels coming from a very large distance. But even more important is the old description by Strabo, who of course visited the place, and says that one could see the pharaohs from a very long distance. And in fact, as you mentioned yesterday, the smoke played an important role in this because it diffuses the light and makes it even easier to see.
Yes.
Yeah, this is another component of it. And of course, there are even exaggerations like the one of Lucian and Plinius that say that one can see them from a 300-mile distance, that is from Athens almost, which might be possible under certain conditions, in fact, and many more. But recently, a very important talk by Professor Rusty Rashid concerning an ancient manuscript translated into Arabic around 900 AD is referred to the optics of constructions by Archimedes, and he says that he found a copy at Kuwait, and there a very interesting combination of two mirrors, one hyperboloidal and one paraboloidal, enable the user, even the mirrors are not very well made, and this is very important, to use them and construct, for example, a telescope like this one that I have here, which is from NASA. We have this type of hyperboloidal and paraboloidal concentric mirrors that can be used to focus X-rays. Now, why they use this system instead of the normal paraboloidal, let's say? Because the wavelength of X-rays is very small compared with the anomalies of the mirror. And if it is really grazing as it is here, it almost hits the mirror parallel to the surface, then one can focus with this system, neglecting really the actual anomalies of the surface. And I believe that this is what is done by this system of mirrors described in the ancient manuscript that we have in Kuwait that translates an even older one by Archimedes. And I would like your opinion about. So I suggest that in the system of the pharaohs, we have something like this, several homocentric sort of generalized cones, hyperboloidal and paraboloidal. Even one is sufficient, one of each, to focus even if the surface is not very smooth. And the same system can be used at the top as a telescope as well. So this is what I propose, that we have really this type of concentric mirrors that can focus even if can focus the light that comes from the bottom of the system to the top, and then this conical structure over there enables to direct the light all around the Mediterranean, let's say. So this is something new. Oh, by the way, this is another possibility. Similar, probably simpler, but it cannot concentrate large amounts of light. And now let's go to another subject, but similar. We have lenses in antiquity. This is known to the specialists, but not to the general public, and also to archaeologists in general, I could say, with exceptions, of course. I had the opportunity to study, to measure, in fact, the qualities of some of them, 7, from the Archaeological Museum of Heraklion. And these 3 are the best that they have in this collection. And of course, I have studied the literature, and here we have the most important modern literature on the subject. And I have studied in parallel something like more than 1,000 paragraphs from ancient texts concerning lenses. Usually the term is ialos, and many more concerning mirrors, that is catoptron, esoptron, enoptron. And we will see that they were in use by the specialists at the time, and even Democritus, it is said, by Posidonius, who was an excellent scientist, politician, and philosopher, of course, that Democritus has used this sort of aids, telescopes really, to observe stars, planets, I suppose, and comets in particular, and he concludes that comets are made of a concentration of little stars. Of course, he saw one comet that was in pieces, passing from the perihelion, obviously, where they normally break into pieces. And I have studied also the quality of the lenses, and here you can see, well, not very well, but the disformation is not that large. The quality that we have eventually is quite good, I believe, from these lenses. I have also a film a bit later. I hope it works. Of course, some of them are broken, as you can see. And there are many around the museums. For example, here we can see one from Cyprus and other places in Mesopotamia. These are from Crete, published by Sakellarakas and co-workers. And many more. This is from Pompeii. And 40 lenses or lentoids discovered by Schliemann during the excavations at Troy. These are now the famous treasure of Troy at the museum, the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. And here you can see through one of these lenses few small pieces that are of the order of less than a centimeter. The quality of this particular one is quite good, I think. Probably we have to use the previous system because it has stopped working, I'm afraid. If you could go further, please, to this series of slides to see some more of the lenses, and then go to the mirrors. Here are some of my measurements. I have used a system of a laser with a diffraction system that gives you a diverging beam of light. And then I use it to focus, here, for example. And at this point, we have the lens, and the function is over there. I have measured the qualities of all of them. The distortion is not that bad, so one can use it to perform all sorts of, here, for example, we have an image through one of them. They can be used for all sorts of works like jewelry, to make seals, very small seals like the one discovered recently at Pylos. And the descriptions go back even to Thales, who, according to Pseudo-Plutarchus, he realized that the moon is made of Earth-like matter because he could see with a mirror. And of course, the same goes to others like Aristoteles here, for example, that discusses the color of the images of the sun using various types of mirrors. Here is Posidonius describing the set of mirrors used by Democritus, so a telescope really. And we have the same by Arrian, set of mirrors. So, and of course we know, most of us, these multiple mirrors used in the catoptrics of Euclid. And continues, I have almost 1,000 of them. Yes, but of course here I have only 10. And Plato also goes to a similar description. They describe real and imaginary images. They use the term phasma for the imaginary ones. Upright, right-handed or left-handed as expected when you have spherical mirrors. And of course, we have a lot of work to do with these a few thousand small parts of ancient texts concerning mirrors and some of them lenses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Professor Moussas. We're going to move on, and we're going to have our very own organizer. Our very own organizer.
Thank you,
of this
Mr. Chairman.
entire
I will
conference.
kindly
Christos,
ask to
Xenophos.
avoid all these difficulties for the gentleman to move the slides, because if this doesn't work, I wouldn't spare time of the conference to change the slides. Can I have the first slide, please? We do it the ancient way. Someone has, okay. So what I'm about to speak are the extreme events that we can see in the great city of Alexandria, or in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, which is the oldest sea on earth that is shrinking because Africa approaches Europe, and it will disappear in some million years from now. Can I have a first slide, please? So the changes that we can see in that area have been described by Aristotle. Alexandria is surrounded by Sahara. Sahara used to be a sea. Can I, the next slide, please? You can see divers here in the Sahara Desert cave. And the next slide, please. No? Yeah? Okay. So you can see how this, the delta of the Nile is changing. It is becoming green twice a year, and you can plant things and prosperity twice the year, which makes you to double profit because of the Nile. According to Herodotus, of course, the Nile, Egypt is the gift of the Nile. And you can see how this prosperity comes. The Nile has been adorned as a god. Can I have the next slide, please? And you can see the god of the Nile. And thank you. And you can see here a statue that is in the Vatican. It's a beautiful sample of the Hellenistic sculpture. We have seen some, and you can compare that one. The interesting part is that it has, that statue has important geophysical measurements on it. The god has two hands. On one hand, there are 9 cubits coming down from his hand, and to the left arm, he has 7 cubits. 7 and 9 makes 16, and 16 cubits was the maximum prosperity for Egypt because of the floods of the Nile. The ratio 9:7 has to do with the ratio of white Nile coming from Ethiopia and the blue Nile coming from Lake Victoria. it is interesting to point out that this statue has been constructed 200 years before Christ. And Stanley has discovered the sources of the Nile looking for Livingstone in the 19th century. So one can see that the knowledge that was lost in Scanderia is more than what we think. They knew about the Nile, they knew the proportions, they knew the discharges of the Nile, and probably they were trying to find a good excuse on the floods. So there is a whole philosophy about that. I will skip that. This is a nilometer in Elephantine Island. There is one nilometer, as you know, in Rhoda Island, outside of Marek Gergis in Cairo. And these are measurements of the flood, of the discharge of the Nile, which is actually the max level of the Nile River from 600 AD through the fall of Constantinople. You can see some years that are particularly interesting, years of drought, 903, 967, 1144, 1200, and a great year of flood, 1360. 1360 is after the complete destruction of Alexandria by the tsunami. The Nile discharge is correlating well with the Southern Oscillation Index that describes the general circulation index in the atmosphere. And you can see that from the recent measurements, there are direct relationships with the Etesian winds as well as with the Southern Oscillation Index, that it is originated in the tropics. The interesting thing about the events of drought and flood are those that have been studied and are studied, and we will hear about them from the next speakers. Now, it is well known that we are in a period between two ice ages. So we are in a warm period, and the glaciers have been melted. The last 22,000 years, you can see that the sea level was about 100 meters below, and now we are at an increasing rate of, just by nature, of 1 millimeter per year. Unfortunately, due to the human intervention in the Anthropocene, we see actually that it has increased to 3 millimeters per year in the Mediterranean, and unfortunately in the northern caps, and so northern and southern polar caps, it is more than 8 or 10 millimeters per year. The sea level trends are shown here from a colleague, Anzi Day, and you can see that the Mediterranean is really flooded slowly but surely, because also in addition to the melting of the ice, you have the changes, the man-made changes that you can see here, and you can see that unfortunately Greece, Turkey, and Alexandria, of course, and Egypt, northern Egypt, are in the red, actually, both in terms of the heat waves in the summertime, as well as from aridity. Professor Lutherbacher here has shown that we have had periods in the past 700 years, periods of drought, periods of flood. We knew that. But what we did not know is that this destabilization of our climate is there. We live it. We live in that destabilized system, and that since it started, for instance, in Greece since the late 1980. In Alexandria, it is not so obvious that aridity, this is from the IPCC report, the drought, we know it produced the first refugees, and these are simulations of the rainfall in Egypt and other places in Africa, simulated until the end of our century. And you can see that, unfortunately, the destabilization started in the 70s. We had the first refugees from Sahel, and now we see, we have passed our date, and we see how things are moving and expected to develop in the decades to come. So we will be left with a redistribution of rainfall that is or can be catastrophic to many places, particularly those places which suffer from aridity. Of course, Alexandria has, it's in Sahara, but it has the Nile. So it depends on the behavior of the waters coming from Ethiopia. Actually, the snow in Ethiopia, and unfortunately, the snow disappears. It has disappeared even in South Africa. And the snows, there are no snows in Kilimanjaro, so the novel would have never been written if it was today. You see here the tombs that are actually submerged because of the increase of the water level. Mr. Zalas has shown that there are places where are stable and you don't see changes in sea level, and there are places which are not stable and they are flooded these are called geologically active regions, and they have they are of specific interest because they do show that there is a synergy of events, and in geophysics, whenever you have synergy of events, you have the largest response and the largest catastrophe. So Ibn Ayyub and Ibn Battuta, you see them here. There is also a nice stamp about him. They have described results of earthquakes. In fact, I heard before that Pharos has been destroyed in 1326. This is wrong, because this was the first time that Ibn Battuta visited Alexandria on his way to Constantinople. He saw the fully destructed Pharos in 1334, I think, when he returned from Constantinople. And so there must have been an earthquake as large as the 1303, and maybe as large as the 365, which was the wave that has been modeled by late Professor Ambrasis and my colleague, Professor Sinolakis. And I'm about to show you a simulation of what has happened to Alexandria after that earthquake. You can see here that, unfortunately, we don't have information before that. But we do have information on big changes that have been global, not only for Alexandria, like the eruption of Vesuvius after the death of the assassination of Julius Caesar. There was no summer, no productivity, no sun. The sun was covered by a thick ash cloud that covered the earth. I'm sure that Dr. Xoplaki, she will give us some more details. This is Crete, not far away from Scanderia, But in fact, there is a port called Falasarna that following the earthquake of 365, it has been lifted by 7 meters or more, and this earthquake created a tsunami that moved, you can see Alexandria to the bottom right. It hit Libya, Tunis, and then it moved to Alexandria, where obviously the height of that wave was so large, and as described by many Arab sources and travelers, ships have been transported on top of the Serapion. So the wave was a multi-meter wave. The estimate of Shaw et al., published in Nature in 2008, was the height of the wave was 20 meters, but I think that Professor Sinolakis has more recent estimates that do show the height to be more. So it appears that this area is highly vulnerable to tsunamis. It has been hit at least 3 times in the last millennium by tsunamis. But moreover, looking for our beloved Alexandria where it is, Professor Sinolakis had a brilliant idea that Lake Mariut is actually it is operating like a lens that concentrates all the debris brought from the sea to the lake. After a tsunami, as you know, the waters bring with them everything that can be from far away in the sea, from the sea to the land. Unfortunately, we have not been able, although this idea has been passed to our colleagues, we haven't had the chance to get any data from Lake Mariut or any surrounding area. We saw from Dr. Eldin before and other speakers that Lake Mariut has been reduced since the Ptolemaic time by about 80%, which is a large dryness in that lake. It has exceeded the drying of many other places on Earth. And I think, my dear Kostas, that we should revisit the issue, forget about the lake because it's a military secret there. You cannot make any measurements, or you cannot get measurements, or people don't want to provide measurements. And we should get a permission to have in the dried already places. There are archaeological sites that I've seen, and we plan to revisit that magnificent past of Alexandria, which we think, actually, I don't know, but we were thinking with late Professor Ambrasis that has followed a creeping subsidence, and it is under the sea. That's the Port Neuf from, you can see also part of the Silsila, and it's from the Description de l'Égypte to remind you the ruins of Alexandria. So we need to find out the ruins in our era. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Zerefos, for this wonderful talk. Our next speaker is Professor Jörg Lutherbacher from the Department of Geography and Climatology, Climate Dynamics and Climate Change at the Justus Liebig University of Gießen in Germany. Jörg?
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks very much for Professor Zerefos from the organization committee, from the local host, and the perfect organization team that's really made possible this interdisciplinary, international conference that it's so exciting, and I learned so much and very happy to be here. And thanks very much for this introduction and invitation. So, I will give you some insights in 15 minutes about paleoclimatic evidence we have for this area, and going back more than 2,000 years. So I will try to give some insight about what we know and especially also what we don't know. So the outline is, I have formulated a couple of questions. The first question is, how can we reconstruct climate, so precipitation, drought, temperature, before we have instrumental data? So how is it possible to use information from nature, from documentary evidence, to derive quantitative measure about past climate? The second question is, what do we know about climate, about precipitation, droughts, temperature variations during the Hellenistic period in southern Greece and eastern Mediterranean? And the last point is, what have tropical volcanoes to do with Nile failures, revolts at the end of Cleopatra's reign? And at the end, a couple of conclusions. So this is a compilation we did, maybe not updated, but I think still impressive, of information from instrumental measurements. We heard already Galilei, that was doing the measurements about pressure, about temperature, and this is a compilation about early instrumental data across the Mediterranean, and the different colors indicate when those time series have started. And we see in brownish towards northern Italy, we have records that go back to the 17th century. In the Mediterranean, eastern Mediterranean, we have records that go to the mid-19th century. But many records actually go back only 50 years. So the question is, how can we extend the observations, the knowledge we have from instrumental data further back in time when we don't have any measurements? And that's somehow what we use. These are examples from documentary and natural proxies for paleoclimate and environmental research in the Mediterranean. There's a compilation of different evidence. I don't want to go too much in detail to all of them, but I will show you some examples about this. So we have speleothems, so we have stalactites, stalagmites growing in caves that give us indirect evidence about hydrology, about changes of moisture. Back in time, we have plankton and pollen in the air, in the sea, that we can collect and analyze and try to interpret to what extent is this related to any kind of climate in the past. We have very importantly historical documents, and Professor Serifos mentioned a couple of them, and also previous speakers point to the fact that there's a lot of historical evidence. We have information from flood records from the Nile, we heard already, we come back to that. We have marine and lacustrine cores, so really at the bottom of lakes in the soil, we can analyze the different sediments, we can try to interpret them. We have tree rings in the Mediterranean, old trees that can live up to maximum 1,000 years. And we have wharfed sediments. So we have independent evidence that is not meteorological measured, but that give us some kind of indirect evidence about past climate in the different areas of the Mediterranean. We have a couple of problems. These proxies, they reflect different climate information. Some of them reflect temperature, some precipitation, droughts, conditions in the sea, pH, chemistry of the ocean or the Mediterranean. Some of these proxies reflect different conditions in different seasons, sometimes related to summer, sometimes related to winter, to the annual. We have also proxies that have different temporal resolution. That's a major issue. So for instance, historical evidence, we have talking about extreme events with implication on society and the economy that are very accurate to the day, sometimes to the hours, but they are not continuous over time. Then we have other information that resolve decades, so one value every couple of decades or even centuries. So we have a widespread of information from natural archives and from documentary evidence that we have to interpret and try to quantify and make somehow temperature out of it, degrees Celsius or millimeter precipitation changes. And a few proxies are available for the Hellenistic period. There's not too much, unfortunately, but there's many groups working on that, and I will present you some of them. So how does it work? How do we work? This is a scheme how we actually develop paleoclimate evidence before the instrumental period. So what we do is, usually we go in the fields where we have this natural information. We go in a cave, we go and drill trees, we go to the sea and corals. So site selection and date collection. Then we date them, we go in the lab, we see how old they are, exact dating, at least if we have this information. We pre-process the data, and then comes statistics into the game. We try to see in a calibration period, these tree rings, when they grow very fast, is this related to moisture deficit or more moisture, or is it a very well summer with high temperature that the tree grows very well in these conditions? So we try to see in the observations in the meteorological period to what extent is climate related to the growth of these natural proxies. Then we validate them. We want to see if this statistical relationship we have generated is stable over time. And finally, we can apply statistics to the long series of tree rings, 1,000 years, sometimes 2,000 years, and speleothem data that cover Holocene or even 100,000s of time of periods, and to develop long time series. That's how we work. And this is a first example of a joint collaboration with many people, also with Elena, Professor Serafos. And to use information from tree ring information here, this is the network. So we see a couple of very long time tree ring series from the Alps and Scandinavia, and some shorter ones from other areas of Europe. So we apply some statistics. We use information from historical documents in Central Europe, and we statistically reconstruct summer temperature over more than 2,000 years. And that's more or less the only really annually resolved temperature reconstruction we can also apply to parts of the Mediterranean, despite the fact we don't have direct measurements of trees from this area. So what we want to show is here the development of summer temperature over the eastern Mediterranean. This is shown here. So this is a very nervous curve, and this is for each year an estimated temperature based on this network here. And we start here with minus 137 years, so BC 137, and this goes till 2013. And in dark blue, it's the best guess of our reconstruction, and in light blue is the uncertainties. So we can reconstruct something, but we have to be aware that we have uncertainties. And this is, if we go 2,000 years in back, this is about plus minus 1 or 1.5 degree. So we have, to be honest, we can reconstruct, but we have uncertainties, and we have really to declare and also mention that we have uncertainties in our reconstructions. So if we go further back in time, we see a rather warm period here, about 70 BC, and then the decrease in temperature, and Elena will come back in her next talk about that, and we see the variations here back in time. So we have at least one piece where we have an annual resolution of Eastern Mediterranean temperature, and I think this is all we can do for the moment at this temporal resolution. Then we have other information from other proxies. This is the Ionian sea surface temperature during the Hellenistic period. This is a record that goes much further back in time and comes also to present conditions. And we see here the Hellenistic period where we have rather warm conditions in the Ionic Sea. And alkanons, this is a kind of proxy that gives us information about sea conditions, specifically here in the Ionian. We show a warm Ionian Sea and slight increase in the warm species for Minifera here. And this is an indication that we have most likely in this area more moisture and potentially eastwards also more precipitation or any kind of moisture. And just to see if this is really the case, we have independent evidence from the Peloponnese in southern Greece. This is a Stymphalia landscape, a lake sediment. So this is the lake. Sometimes it dries out. Sometimes we have water there. And we can drill here, as the Germans and also Greek and Stockholm team were doing over the last couple of years, and just analyze the sediments in this lake over the past 10,000 years, and just to date them and see to what extent these sediments tell us something about precipitation or moisture fluxes during that period, together with cave information also from the Peloponnese. And this is an analysis. Here, this is 1000 BCE, this is AD 1, and this is today's conditions. So this is a proxy that tells us something about temperature. And as you can see, the resolution, it's not so good. We cannot say something about each year. We can say something about decades to century with uncertainties in the dating. But nevertheless, this shows here that here in this area of southern Greece, we had quite warm conditions. And at the end, as the other tree-ring information was indicating, we have a degree of temperature. And Elena will come back to that in terms of what models tell us. In terms of moisture, we have two different cave information that tell us here, if we are in the positive, that we had more moisture. So it was wetter, more precipitation. We cannot quantify how much more, and we can also not say too much about uncertainties, but nevertheless, these two series, they tell us we were living in a quite warm period during Hellenistic time, and also wetter than compared to today. And at the end, maybe we go towards drier conditions, and that it's here summarized. What we did now, if we go a bit further to the east, to other places of Eastern Mediterranean, this is a compilation of different proxies we have that are published. We just put them in a map, and we updated them. So you see the different colors and different location of proxies where we have that cover more the instrumental period. Some are 200-300 years, some are 600-700 years, some are 1, 2, 3, 4,000 years back in time. And I just want to show you here, this is the place we had a look at, Peloponnese, and then we look a bit more towards this place, towards Eastern Mediterranean, and then also to northeastern Africa. And this is a quite amazing picture, and that needs a bit more time. I cannot tell you too much into detail because that's a lot of chemical analysis of these proxies, but nevertheless I want to show some information about that. So this is the period about the Hellenistic period, about 300 BCE to about 0 AD, and this is today's information. We have different graphs referring to different proxies that tell us something about past climate. And now we just want to show a couple of long of them from speleothems, so from caves. These are from northern Greece here. This is a cave, and this is related to moisture availability. Not too much about precipitation itself, but moisture effective in this area reported in this cave. So we see here, this period was maybe a bit drier compared to other periods over the last 2,000 years. Then we have the Kocain cave in southern Turkey. We see rather wet conditions, then drying, and so on. And we have north of Iraq, an area here that shows us some information that it was not too wet, too dry compared to today. And we have also the Sorek cave that shows not too much information. So we have heterogeneous patterns of some area that were wetter, some are that were drier than periods that followed. Now we can have a look here in Alexandria or northern Egypt or Egypt. Do we have any information? And Professor Seraphos and other speakers point to the fact, to the nilometers that go back to 622. And before, there's hardly any evidence. We heard already about the lakes that were actually man-made, that were reservoirs from the Nile, but used for agriculture. So we can measure paleolimnology about sea level changes, lake level changes, but that's not really climate what we record there, but more activity of humans. So here I want to show you some written evidence that's not from our work, that's recently published in Nature. So written evidence before the era of the Nilometer about a nail failure in the mid-3rd century BCE. And you see here the document. This is a courtesy from Department of Papyrology, University of Warsaw, Professor Manning. And that's the information we have from that period, and that's somehow a translation. It's probably from the mid-3rd century, mentioning the Nile failure for 3 years and the intervention of an irrigation machine that will water the whole Nile Valley and save Egypt from famine. So there's some kind of mitigation, the impacts of Nile floods already at that point. And we heard already also about the great scientists that during that period. And there were also external territories in Anatolia, Syria, capable of rain-fed agriculture, buffer the state against the Nile failure. Interestingly, also what we heard from Professor Serafos also is the importance of the Nile for Egypt. And before the 20th century damming, the summer flood driving from the monsoon, what we heard also in the Ethiopian highlands, began with rising waters at Aswan in the south, peaking August, September in the north, and receding the end of October when crop sowing began. So there is now evidence about volcanoes, large tropical volcanoes that change the hydrology of the African monsoons. So what happens, I don't want to go into too much detail, but the atmospheric circulation, the distribution of energy changes after strong tropical volcanoes. And in the way that we get less precipitation here in the area where actually the Nile is developing. And this is, we can observe this from the observations, we have indication from the past. So after strong tropical volcano, we have a reduction of precipitation in the area where Nile is generating. And we see this also here in this anomaly plot. So we have less rain, and then of course also less rain that it's drainage towards the north. And we find this also, this is a volcanic index here of the last, from the Ptolemaic area, Roman Quiet period to 200 ADs. And we see the peaks of strong tropical volcanoes, and we see also the evidence we see in documentary evidence. So for instance, what we saw already is since during the last 3 years, the river Nile has not flooded, the dryness will produce a famine. So we saw also the implication of reduced precipitation related potentially from this volcanic event. And we have also the 46, 44 BCE strong event in Cleopatra's reign, a bad time in Egypt with both famine and plague, at least 2 years of zero flood. So we can have these strong tropical volcanoes, and in more or less all cases we see all the reduction of precipitation and the social implication. So the Ptolemaic dynasty ended with Cleopatra's suicide in 30 BC, what we heard already. We had strong impact before, the repeated Nile failure, plague, famine, inflation, administrative corruption, rural depopulation, migration, and land abandonment. But this volcanic eruption, in addition to that, put a strong stress on society, and it contributed, it is not the only reason, it is one of many other reasons that are mentioned there that are actually responsible also for the elite rule and against the cessation of Ptolemaic state warfare with their great rival, the Seleucid Empire. So, as once more, volcanoes are just one factor to account for socio-economic crisis in ancient Egypt. And now I come to the conclusions. I think we have quite a good distribution of proxies, of the different proxies across the Mediterranean, covering more than 2,000 years. Most information relates to changes of the hydrological cycle, but we are far away. We just have local information to understand the full range of climate variation, including extremes with social implications, drought and flood periods, and also seasonal aspects over the last couple of centuries. The Hellenistic period in parts of Greece were rather wet and warm, what the proxies tell us, with uncertainties, and at the end slightly cooler and drier conditions with a warmer Ionic Sea that maybe is somehow a provider of moisture towards the east. We found also heterogenic climate signals across the eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East, so it's not just a wet period all over, but we have a lot of local and regional climate variability during that period. And volcanoes during the Ptolemaic era suppressed Nile summer flooding and contributed to the socio-economic crisis in ancient Egypt. And with climate models, what Elena will tell you more can help us to understand past climate changes in terms of internal variability and force variability from the sun, from volcano, in terms of climate variations. In this case, thanks very much for your attention.
Can I just something to clarify? When we say that rainfall deficit or surplus, we mean a redistribution of water, because water on our planet remains the same.
Okay. Our next speaker is Dr. Elena Xoplaki, who is also a professor in the Department of Geography, Climatology, Climate Dynamics, and Climate Change at the Justus Liebig University of Gießen in Germany. Elena, we look forward to it.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you and the organizing committee for giving me the opportunity of being here. It has been an amazing source of knowledge, what I have received, what I've learned since yesterday morning. It has been really a great experience for me. So then I take from where Jörg stopped, and I'm going to try to use models, paleo models, and trying to understand what do they tell us about the Hellenistic period in the Eastern Mediterranean. I'm going to start from the brother, if you like, of the series that Jörg has shown you till now. That is the European summer temperature, the mean over the whole European area. And here you can see the variability of the first 300 years of the reconstruction. In our case, and especially in the case of the paleo models, the Hellenistic period cannot go further back in time. So we're going to restrict to the first 300 years up to the year 200 AD, the 2nd century AD. So what we can see is that in the first 100 years, we have a relatively low variability, meaning we don't have such a big changes from high to low temperature values if we compare it especially with the recent decades. And what we can also see is that we have temperatures that are not very far from the mean conditions of the 1961 to 1990 that we're using here. What we can of course see is this low towards the end of the, or mid of the 2nd century AD, and also this small downward, or this low quite earlier in the period. We will see that might be that these are indeed already indications of two large volcanic eruptions that we see in the volcanic records. So, as we would like to discuss about climate models, this is just a very simple, very small summary of what climate models are doing. They are indeed complex mathematical representations of the major components of the climate, that is atmosphere, that is ocean, land surface, and sea ice, and of course their interactions. So we are considering all these modules for atmosphere and ocean and the interactions between them. What climate models are doing are in regularly spaced intervals. They are using the basic laws of physics and try to explain and interpret how the system is working. At the same time, we cannot see everything there. Climates do require high computational capacities in order to bring all this information in a special interactive way. There is something new. This is the current, the advantages, or what is new with the current generation of climate models. Now we are not talking anymore about general circulation models, but we are talking about fully coupled Earth system models that do not only contain information, do not only contain models of the atmosphere and ocean that are totally interacting, but they are including as well models for the interaction with the land use and land use changes that are representing as well the terrestrial carbon cycle. They are representing the atmospheric chemistry and ocean biochemistry. What is new at the same time is that we're going down or we're going up with a spatial resolution up to 1 degree spatial resolution around the globe, which means that we have a quite high detail, especially when we're discussing the information and the simulation of climate over around the globe. Other than that, we have an extension of the forcing. We do know that climate models are representing the climate system, our chaotic climate system. And this climate system has its own internal variability. And when there was no forcing, there is no external push, if you like, there's no forces from outside the system, then our climate models are producing information based on their own internal variability, following, of course, the basic laws of physics, fluids, and thermodynamics. Other than that, we have, as I said, new extended forcing data that do enable us to go further back than the 800 AD. We didn't have in such a detailed information going further back in time. And when I'm talking about detail, I'm talking also about a very high temporal resolution, which goes up to a 6-hourly output. And I'm not talking such a long time series that are covering a few thousands of years, but with a much lower temporal resolution. This means that we can go further back than the second millennium AD, which was indeed till now the ability of the climate models to simulate climate around the globe. Then let us have a look at these forcings, this extension of the forcings. We're talking, of course, mainly about the orbital forcing, which is indeed connected to the variations of the Earth's orbit around the Sun, and this is how we are receiving the changes. In the seasonality, the changes are usually represented during the different seasons. We also have the solar forcing, that is, of course, the output of the Sun, and this is, of course, connected to the energy that is absorbed by the Earth's atmosphere. And then, of course, the short-term but extremely important volcanic forcing, mainly due to the large tropical volcanic eruptions that are not only feeding aerosols, they're not only feeding sulfates to the atmosphere, but they have also the possibility, the ability to reach the stratosphere and then influence our climate for the next 2-3 years after the large tropical eruptions. So let us have a look how changes have taken place. This is the change in the orbital forcing 2,000 years before and today. So anything that you see in reddish colors are positive. So this means that we have less insolation in present day compared to 2,000 years ago, and everything in blue means that we have more insolation in present day compared to 2,000 years ago. So what we can see is that always during spring we do have much more insolation than 2,000 years ago in the present day, while we see a totally different picture during the boreal autumn and summer. Of course, what is taking place is that globally and annually, we have an average out of this change. The change in the orbital forcing we do observe, of course, in the seasons. What do we have here? This is the solar forcing, the extension of the solar forcing. We have information about the evolution of the total solar irradiance over the last 2,000 years. What we can see, of course, what is very well known, the solar minima, Oort, Wolf, Spörer, Maunder, and Dalton minimum. These minima that we mainly observe in the second millennium AD. There's nothing much important when it comes to the solar minima in the first millennium AD, while when we're looking the period we are studying, there is no minimum that could be indeed influencing our climate. And now the volcanic forcing, what we know till now, what the models that I'm going to show you have used as external forcing. You can see here, this is the aerosol tropical depth for the tropical band between 0 and 30 degrees north. Of course, what we see here, these are the strong tropical volcanic eruptions. And we can see that we have indicated the most important tropical volcanic eruptions, and we can very well see that we have much more eruptions in the second millennium AD and not as much in the first millennium AD. And even we haven't observed anything as large to influence, as we expect, the climate in the period that we're looking at, except for the event in the year 169, possibly connected with a negative, with a reduction of temperature that I showed you at the very beginning. Here is the information about the climate model that I'm going to show you. This is the Max Planck Institute Earth System Model. This is the Paleo branch. And it does take into consideration changes in the solar, orbital, and volcanic forcing, as well as, of course, greenhouse gases. There are 3 ensemble simulations currently available or available to be used, and the differences in these simulations are the changes in the differences in the oceanic conditions. Let us have a look then what this model shows us, this Earth system model shows about the Eastern Mediterranean. What you see here in different colors are the 3 simulations. And we can see that for December, January, February, winter, and June, July, August, summer period, for the time that we are interested in, we see that we have a distinct seasonal cooling till around the end of the 2nd century, which is indeed, if you consider that we are talking always about temperatures that are above 0, here these are deviations, meaning differences from reference period. So everything that is positive means that we have warmer conditions. We can see this cooling in both seasons, and we can also see that during winter we have a much larger variability compared to the summer. At the same time, we see a larger spread between the simulations, especially at the times when we don't have really much of external forcing, so not strong volcanic forcing, as we can see here at the very beginning of the period. But we do see this. We do see this reduction of temperature to very low levels, possibly connected to this event of the 169 AD period. That it poses, of course, questions. Yes, we do know that volcanic eruptions, large tropical volcanic eruptions, affect climate, global climate, and we do know that we receive the year without a summer, so influence mainly during the summertime. However, if we do have a look how large tropical volcanic eruptions influence the winter climate, we can see that here you have the circulation at around 5,000 meters above the sea, above the Earth surface. We can identify an anomalous continental cold air advection towards our area, which is an explanation of the low temperatures that we see over the Eastern Mediterranean. However, and this is something that we shouldn't forget, is that each one of these tropical volcanic eruptions do leave an own specific fingerprint on the climate. So, I would like to go a little bit further. Till now, what I showed you is that we don't have so much information, we don't have so much forcing going during the Hellenistic period, but models do show us much more. We heard till now what proxies do, but here what we can see is what is indeed the trigger, what is causing the changes that are recorded in the proxies. So I'm going to have a look a bit more into this period, this reduction of temperature, still in the positive domain, with warmer temperatures over the Eastern Mediterranean. And this is what our models can do. Here you have the first and the third ensemble. The first and the second ensemble agree very well. That's why you don't see it here. So we can see the mean of the period 75 to 50 BC in the spatial window. So what we can see is these warmer near-surface temperatures. Remember, we were always in the positive domain. Over the Eastern Mediterranean are decreasing according to our time series to the levels of our reference period, which is some centuries later. We do see these slightly yellowish colors showing these warmer conditions. But what we also see at the same time is that both ensembles, even if they are different, do show warming over the Arctic. But why are these observations? Why this simulation is coming? What we see is that these warmer temperatures are associated with a stronger subtropical anticyclone and a mid-latitude low pressure. Indeed, both patterns do show very similar pictures. They're resembling in both cases a positive phase of the North Atlantic Oscillation. But what we see, the difference here, is that we have in the third ensemble that is indeed showing us the Arctic cooling much more to the west. We have a presence of an anticyclone over to the north, possibly likely connected to the Siberian anticyclone. So what we see is this influence of the subtropical anticyclone reaching much more to the east and influencing our temperature conditions. I haven't told you anything about precipitation. Haven't done that because we are in an area with high complexity. Morphology does pose a big question in our area, and precipitation, it's not as an easy, if you would like, variable as temperature. Let us then go a little bit further because there's much more coming. There are many new informations about external forcings, reconstructions that go further back in time. And these are enabling, indeed, Holocene simulations. And Holocene simulations that do have this high spatial resolution and, even more importantly, temporal resolution. So what you see here, this is the solar forcing reconstruction. This is an extract from a 9,300 years long reconstruction, which is based on the open solar magnetic field and the cosmogenic radionuclide beryllium-10 that is measured in ice cores. Or here, even more important, the volcanic forcing extension that is indeed increasing the large tropical eruptions in the first millennium AD and do include in this reconstruction the eruptions of the 44-46 BC, likely a large tropical eruption in Nicaragua, very synchronous to the Vesuvius eruption, and also the largest ever recorded tropical eruption in the year 426 BC. What you see here, this line, this is the limit of the Pinatubo eruption of the recent years. So let us go into the conclusions that we were able to see that in agreement, indeed, not much disagreement to the proxy. So from the reasoning, from the trigger to the result, we do see that we had warmer winter and summer temperatures during the Hellenistic period, during the period that we are looking at over the Eastern Mediterranean. Further, what is very important is that the new IPCC highly resolved simulations, the new runs do extend further back in time, enabled by the new reconstructions of external forcing. And these new runs are going to provide an extremely important basis, temporally, highly temporally, and spatially resolved, that will allow data model comparisons and will allow us, of course, even more importantly, to understand processes and dynamics in the Eastern Mediterranean during the Hellenistic period. And with that, I would like to thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena. We can have a discussion. Questions for the speakers? Do you have a question?
Δημητρόπουλος ονομάζομαι. Θα ήθελα να απευθύνω μια ερώτηση στον κύριο Τζερεφό, καθότι και μέλος της Οργανωτικής Επιτροπής, κατά πόσο το επιστημονικό ερώτημα που ανεπτύχθη στο τέλος του 20ου αιώνα, εάν από τον εκπρόσωπο του αφροκεντρισμού, του Μάρτιν Μπέρναρντ, σχέση ότι η γνώση, αν οι Έλληνες σοφοί δίδαξαν ή διδάξαν στην Αιγυπτό και γενικότερα στη Μέση Ανατολή, μεταξύ της διαστάσεως ότι ο Αριστοτέλης έκλεψε την γνώση από την βιβλιοθήκη της Αλεξανδρίας, σχέση και με την απάντηση που υπήρξε από την Μέρι Λεύκοβιτς. Ευχαριστώ θερμός.
Κοιτάξτε, όλοι αυτοί που είπατε ήταν αυτόφωτοι. Δεν υπήρχε το θέμα κλεψιάς τότε. Αντιθέτως, όπως ίσως ακούσατε, ξεκίνησε το peer review, το οποίο δείχνει το υψηλό επίπεδο ερεύνης που υπήρχε. Επομένως, αυτοί όλοι ήταν αυτόφωτοι και ήταν τόσο μεγάλα πνεύματα, ώστε τους συναντάμε ακόμα και σήμερα. Χωρίς εκείνους δεν θα είχαμε πάει πουθενά. Αυτό που θέλω να τονίσω, αν αυτό σας ικανοποιεί σαν απάντηση, αυτό που θέλω να τονίσω εγώ, κύριε Πρόεδρε, είναι ότι αυτό που θέλω να... η σημερινή συνεδρίαση που αφορά στο περιβάλλον, θέλω να καλέσω τους συναδέλφους που ασχολούνται με την αρχαιολογία να ενσκύψουν λίγο παραπάνω στα αίτια φαινομένων τα οποία οδήγησαν σε ιστορικά γεγονότα σπουδαία. Για παράδειγμα, το Ταμπόρα, που είναι το πιο πρόσφατο, συνέβη μερικούς μήνες πριν από το Waterloo. Το Waterloo το έχασε ο Ναπολέον, διότι ενώ ήταν άριστος στο πυροβολικό, το πυροβολικό του είχε ακυρωθεί, είχε ακινητοποιηθεί από τη λάσπη που υπήρχε μετά από τις φοβερές βροχές που ακολούθησαν το Ταμπόρα, το οποίο μάλιστα οδήγησε στη συνέχιση των βροχοπτώσεων όχι μόνο τον Ιούνιο που ήταν το Waterloo, αλλά και τον Ιούλιο και τον Αύγουστο, και είναι το περίφημο έτος χωρίς θέρος, και δυστυχώς αυτό το έτος διέφυγε της προσοχής και σε άλλα σπουδαία ιστορικά γεγονότα. Το ότι χάνεται ένας πόλεμος ή πέφτει μια αυτοκρατορία ασφαλώς δεν είναι θέμα μόνον περιβαλλοντικών γεγονότων, αλλά τόσο μεγάλων όπως είναι το Ταμπόρα, νομίζω πρέπει να ενσκύψουμε. Ο Lord Byron και η Shelley είναι εκείνοι που έγραψαν το Darkness, το περίφημο ποίημα, περιγράφοντας πόσο σκοτίνιασε ο καιρός όλο το καλοκαίρι του 1815, η δε Shelley εφήβρε τον Φραγκενστάιν από τα αστροπελέκια που πέφτανε συνεχώς και το περιγράφει ακόμα και στο Preface. Περιγράφει πώς ενεπνεύστη τον Φραγκενστάιν. Σημειωτέων ότι και οι δύο παραθέριζαν οι οικογένειές τους στη λίμνη της Γενέβης τον ίδιο μήνα, στο ίδιο ξενοδοχείο. Επομένως, αν δεν υπάρχουν άλλες, κύριε Πρόεδρε...
Αν δεν υπάρχουν άλλες ερωτήσεις, θα κάνουμε διάλειμμα μέχρι τις 2 και 4. Και θα ξαναξεκινήσουμε. We'll start again with the cultural heritage and legal issues at 2:15. Thank you very much.
48 BC, the attack of Aurelian in AD 270 to 275, the decree of Coptic Pope Theophilus of Alexandria in AD 391, and the Muslim conquest of Egypt in AD 642. Then the Imperial Library of Constantinople. Much like the Library of Alexandria, ancient and modern sources identify several occasions for its partial destruction. But the Imperial Library of Constantinople was completely destroyed in 1204 by the Knights of the Fourth Crusade, while its contents, including rare Byzantine manuscripts, were burned or stolen. Also, the archival library hosting the Maya codices of Yucatan, which was destroyed in 1562 by Bishop Diego de Landa, a Franciscan monk and conquistador during the Spanish conquest of Yucatan in Mexico. Interestingly, several centuries later, the 20th century witnessed some of the worst destruction of libraries and archives during armed conflicts. We indicatively mention the destruction of the library of the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, burned in 1940 by Nazi occupation troops. The National Library of Cambodia, which was burned in 1979 by the Khmer Rouge. The National and University Library of Bosnia and Herzegovina in Sarajevo, which was completely destroyed in 1992 by the Bosnian Serb army during the siege of Sarajevo. The Iraqi National Library, as well as the university libraries of Baghdad, which were damaged and destroyed during the 2003 Iraqi war, and the Mosul Public Library in Iraq, completely destroyed by the so-called Islamic State in 2015. Following the reference to the last three library destructions in Sarajevo, Baghdad, and Mosul, one can see that, as was the case in antiquity, culture has moved over the last decades to the front line of wars as a means to foster more violence, hatred, and vengeance. Quite recently, we have witnessed an unprecedented cultural cleansing, a cleansing which targets mainly archaeological sites of the greatest importance for humanity, cultural property of significant importance and value, as well as places of worship belonging to religious minorities. Recent conflicts in Mali, Libya, Yemen, Iraq, and Syria have demonstrated that the protection of cultural heritage is much more pressing than ever before. Protection of cultural property in armed conflict is governed by international humanitarian law. The pertinent rules of international humanitarian law are found in several multilateral treaties and in customary international law. The centerpiece of the relevant treaty law is the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict, together with its two protocols. The 1954 Convention was the first international treaty dedicated exclusively to the protection of cultural heritage in the event of armed conflict, including belligerent occupation. It was adopted together with a protocol, the so-called First Protocol, which targets exclusively at preventing export of cultural property from occupied territory and requires the return of such property to the territory of the state from which it was removed. The 1954 Convention contains a definition of cultural property that covers movable and immovable cultural property, including both libraries and archives. The Hague Convention creates a specific emblem to identify protected cultural property, provides for a system of general and special protection of cultural property, and prohibits the use of property for military purposes. In addition to its protection under the Hague Convention and its two protocols, cultural property in time of war is also specifically protected by the 1977 Protocol 1 on international armed conflicts and 1977 Protocol 2 on non-international armed conflicts. In accordance with the articles that you can see on the screen, only military objectives are to be made the object of attack. Civilians and civilian objects, among them cultural objects, as being civilian objects, should not be attacked. It is also noteworthy that even when a state is not a party to either of the above instruments, it remains bound by the relevant obligations imposed by customary international law of armed conflict, the content of which mirrors to a large extent the rules embodied in treaty form in the 1954 Hague Convention. The destruction, however, of cultural property in the course of the conflicts that took place in the early 90s highlighted the necessity for a number of improvements in relation to the implementation of the Hague Convention. A review of the Convention was initiated in 1991 and resulted in the adoption in 1999 of a second protocol, additional and supplementary to the Convention. The new elements introduced by this second protocol, which at the same time reflect the new developments in international law as to the protection of culture in armed conflict, are the following. The first element is the broadening of the scope of application of the protection, since the second protocol contains a specific chapter on its application in armed conflicts not of an international character, occurring within the territory of one of the contracting parties. And this is very important if one considers that modern conflicts have drastically changed over the last few years with the introduction of new actors in conflict zones, such as transnational armed terrorist groups. As an indication, the armed conflicts which occur at present in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, and earlier in Mali and Afghanistan, as well as in other regions, constitute in principle conflicts not of an international character. Another important element is the strengthening of the obligation to respect cultural objects by introducing the concept of the military objective. Military objective means an object which, by its nature, location, purpose, or use, makes an effective contribution to the military action and whose total or partial destruction, capture, or neutralization, in the circumstances ruling at the time, offers a definite military advantage. The introduction of this concept is extremely important as confirming the principle that cultural objects are primarily civilian goods, and as a consequence, their destination is neither to enhance military efforts nor to be used as military objectives. So an example to be avoided is the case, as you see on the screen, of the world's best preserved Crusader castle, the 12th century Crac de Chevalier in Syria and Homs province, bombed by the Syrian air forces in 2014 because it was used to dislodge rebel fighters who had based themselves therein. An innovative new element introduced by the second protocol is undoubtedly the criminalization of specific acts against cultural property committed intentionally and in violation of the Convention or the second protocol, as well as the introduction of a system of effective enforcement at the national level. For the most serious violations of the second protocol, states parties have the obligation to adopt such measures as may be necessary to establish as criminal offenses under their domestic law these serious violations and to make them punishable by appropriate penalties. Furthermore, for the most serious of them, as for instance the attack against cultural property under enhanced protection, the parties shall, pursuant to the principle of universal jurisdiction, either prosecute or extradite the alleged offender who is present in their territory, even if the latter is not their national or the offense is not committed in their territory. So one can see that the second protocol builds to a large extent to the statute of the International Criminal Court. Another very important innovation of the second protocol is the creation of a monitoring mechanism, the Intergovernmental Committee for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict, which is composed of 12 states. Another element introduced by the second protocol is the establishment of a new system of protection of cultural property, the enhanced protection, which is a sort of immunity enjoyed by specific cultural objects, or property in the event of armed conflict. A cultural property under enhanced protection, as well as its immediate surroundings, must not be used for military purposes or to shield military sites. For achieving the granting of enhanced protection for cultural property under their jurisdiction or control, the parties should submit to the committee a specific request. The committee examines, in each particular case, whether the three conditions that you see on the screen are met cumulatively. Another new element is the specification of the obligation for the safeguarding of cultural property in time of peace by taking preparatory measures. And this is very important, not only in the event of an armed conflict, but equally for the protection of cultural property in the event of unforeseeable natural disasters. An additional mechanism introduced by the second protocol is a trust fund, established in order to provide financial or other assistance, first in support of preparatory or other measures to be taken in peacetime, and second in relation to emergency measures to be taken in order to protect cultural property during periods of armed conflict or of immediate recovery after the end of hostilities. In the context of taking emergency measures for immediate recovery after the end of hostilities, Mali was granting, upon its previous request, financial assistance in 2012 in order for this country to restore a significant number of its national cultural property, including a national library and precious archives, which were seriously damaged by Islamic revolutionary forces which had taken control over the northern part of this country. Among the essential issues which still are of major concern, the relevant discussions are concentrated exclusively to potential operational and procedural arrangements which would allow to supervise and control the application of the Hague Convention and its second protocol by inter alia sending technical missions in situ in the event of an armed conflict, including occupation. Of course, it is obvious that we are talking here about pre-conflict and post-conflict activities. Indicatively, you can see on the screen some relevant actions in this respect already undertaken by UNESCO in Iraq and Mali. Here you can see that UNESCO developed a heritage passport of cultural sites in northern Mali with GPS coordinates of these sites, and these passports were distributed to armed forces prior to the military intervention in Mali in January 2013. Now, let me turn to some quite recent developments in the context of the international protection of cultural property in armed conflict. I have some more minutes too. The introduction of a new distinctive emblem for property under enhanced protection. Unlike the Hague Convention, which provides for the use of a distinctive emblem for the recognition and protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict, the second protocol does not provide for the use of a specific emblem for the marking of cultural property under enhanced protection. To remedy this problem, a new distinctive emblem was introduced in December 2015 by UNESCO. This is the distinctive emblem for cultural property under enhanced protection. Another significant development is the establishment of synergies among the Hague Convention and its two protocols on the one side and the other UNESCO cultural conventions on the other for raising awareness on the need to protect cultural heritage, tangible and intangible, in conflict areas. A very significant development that is worth mentioning is the adoption by the United Nations Security Council of Resolution 2199, which strongly condemns the repeated deliberate attacks against cultural property, in particular in the Syrian Arab Republic and Iraq. This resolution represents a landmark in the recognition of the direct linkage between the destruction and pillage of cultural heritage and the financing of terrorism. Most importantly, it highlights the side consequences of the destruction of cultural heritage in Iraq and Syria, namely the looting of antiquities and their illicit trafficking and trade in order to finance terrorist acts. As to this specific issue, ladies and gentlemen, it is a common secret that a large number of artifacts illegally taken from armed conflict areas end up in antiquities markets in countries neighboring the territories under Daesh's control. And not only. Auction houses have also been reported to sell on the open markets artifacts originating from the controlled regions by the so-called Islamic State, accompanied by false documentation, while the internet usage has immensely enlarged the possibilities of this illegal trade. As to the targeted destruction of cultural property, I would be remiss not to mention a very important recent development, which is the conviction on 27 September 2016 by the International Criminal Court of Ahmad al-Faqi al-Mahdi for war crimes related to the destruction of protected cultural heritage in Mali under Article 8 of the International Criminal Court Statute. Ahmed al-Faqi al-Mahdi was sentenced to 9 years imprisonment, and this was the first case related to destruction of cultural heritage handled by the ICC, and the first case in front of the ICC to consider the actions of a terrorist movement linked to Al-Qaeda. A very important development that is worth mentioning is the launching of the military manual on the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict, which is intended to serve as a practical guide on the implementation by military forces of the rules of international law for the protection of culture in armed conflict. Another development is, a recent one, is the adoption by UNESCO of a strategy for the reinforcement of the organization's actions for the protection of culture and the promotion of cultural pluralism in the event of armed conflict. Finally, in the context of the United Nations, the most recent development is the adoption by the Security Council of Resolution 2347, focusing on the targeted destruction of cultural heritage in armed conflict. This is a very important development because it is for the first time that the Security Council adopts a resolution exclusively devoted to the overall issue of the protection of cultural heritage in armed conflict without necessarily focusing on Iraq or Syria or the financing of terrorism, as was the case with its previous resolutions. Most importantly, this resolution, 2347, introduces in its operative part the concept of safe havens for movable cultural property in danger and encourages member states to take preventive measures to safeguard their state-owned cultural property, including through documentation in a network of safe havens in their own territories. And in concluding, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say that the multifaceted abuse of culture linked with a strategy which seeks to eliminate all forms of diversity and irreparably damage any form of collective knowledge and archival memory seems to be a key feature of modern wars, especially in intrastate conflicts involving non-state actors. We see cultural heritage and cultural diversity in all its forms being targeted, as is also the case with professionals working to defend the cultural heritage of a population. We have all observed that the rules of international humanitarian law are not respected, and the rules concerning cultural property are no exception. In light of the above, it is more than obvious that there is an imperative need to enlarge and rethink traditional approaches to protect heritage and to connect the dots between cultural, security, and humanitarian aspects in full respect of the mandate and prerogatives of every actor. In other words, the introduction of the cultural dimension in the overall framework of prevention and resolution of disputes seems to be an extremely urgent political need. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Papathanasiou, for your extremely inspiring and sad and bad news about our global culture. Hopefully the good news will come, but we want to see more people going to jail, not only that fellow you have shown to us. Professor Christos Milonopoulos is our next speaker, who has posed an interesting question about the possession of the Parthenon marbles according to the British law, their legality and other issues.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to congratulate the organizing committee for the impeccable organization of this unique event, and Professor Zerefos especially for his initiative for this conference. The topic I'm going to speak about refers to the controversial question whether the Parthenon marbles are under lawful possession according to the existing English law, not about the question of repatriation, not whether the British Museum is obliged to return the marbles, but only it refers to the question whether the possession, the mere possession of the marbles is lawful according to British law. An American writer, Merriman, in his fundamental work thinking about the Elgin marbles, which appeared in 1985, upholds the notion that from a legal point of view, the British Museum is in equitable possession of the marbles. He states that under the international law of that time, the Ottomans were really entitled to give Elgin the right to remove the marbles. Moreover, he admits that although the scope of the initial firman was limited, the final removal of the monuments was ratified by the Sultan, and therefore it was thus validated. What surprises us in these arguments, however, is that Merriman invokes international law, but he bases on the international law, only one principle, that of the ownership. That is, whether the Ottomans truly allowed Elgin to acquire ownership according to civil law of the marbles. Even if it is so, Merriman himself admits that under the contemporary international law, it might be argued that the Ottoman permission to remove Greek antiquities were illegal, thus clouding Elgin's title to the marbles. Merriman makes so a contradistinction between the old and the new international law, which nevertheless obscures the picture to a dangerous degree and generates an artificial confusion for the following reasons. If Merriman's argument was correct, then the war criminals of Nuremberg and Tokyo trials, Eichmann and the soldiers who executed civilians who tried to cross the borders of East Germany, should have been acquitted. The general principles of law that are recognized by civilized countries were the true legal foundation of Nuremberg. Nowadays, there is no doubt that customary international law constitutes a source of law and is in complete harmony with the principle of legality. The Nuremberg Court, the European Court of Human Rights in the case, a case concerning criminal law offenders, international law offenders in Ukraine, the German Constitutional Court and the rules of the International Criminal Court view these principles as an ultimum refugium. In addition to the above, which are general ideas, the following concrete observations must be made. Merriman's addition that under the rules and principles of international law currently in force, the removal of the marbles would be illegal, I quote, thus clouding Elgin's title to the marbles, is critical because it generates, in accordance with English law, questions regarding the legality, the liability of the possession for two reasons. First, because the possession of the marbles may establish liability by omission, and second, because it may violate the English Proceeds of Crime Act currently in force. In English law, as in Greek law, it is accepted that criminal liability originating in omission can be established under three conditions. First, a duty to be acted upon. Second, knowledge of the circumstances and extent of the duty. And third, the actual ability to fulfill it. Are these circumstances in the matter of the marbles that establish a duty to act according to the English law in force? The rules of international law currently in force are extremely explicit. More specifically, first, even though the provisions of the International court on former Yugoslavia and those of the ICC obviously provide for individual criminal liability for the destruction of criminal property in the context of armed conflict and not in time of peace, it is strongly contended that the vandalism of cultural goods may be regarded as an international crime either on the basis of customary law or on the basis of the law created by the ICC regarding the former Yugoslavia. Second, even more important is the UNESCO declaration concerning the intentional destruction of cultural heritage of October 2003, signed in the wake of the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas by the Taliban. The declarations emphasizes, among others, that a state that intentionally destroys or intentionally fails to take appropriate measures to prohibit, prevent, stop, and punish any intentional destruction of criminal heritage of great importance for humanity bears the responsibility for such destruction. And states should take all appropriate measures in accordance with international law to establish jurisdiction over and provide effective criminal sanctions against those persons who commit or order to be committed acts of intentional destructions of cultural heritage. This is to say that the destruction of cultural heritage in time of peace establishes the criminal liability of the individual or the state that allowed or did not avert the act, irrespective of the place in which it was committed and the law in force in the country it was committed. Of course, the UNESCO declaration is not yet law, an obligatory law. It is not a law in force, but the criminal liability is not for omission is not only based on a statute, a law statute, but it can be based also on a contract or a previous dangerous activity, and a previous dangerous activity is already given by the vandalism against the marbles. As per Merriman's own admission, perpetuating the present situation is illegal by today's standards. Furthermore, these perpetuations violates the UNESCO declaration since the British Museum omits to take all appropriate measures for remedying vandalism, which, if committed in our times, would be no different to the crimes by the Islamic State and the Taliban. Therefore, according to English law itself, the perpetuation of this illicit situation raises issues of criminal liability through omission. But it is Merriman himself who, admittedly in conjunction with later legal developments, provides the most essential argument in favor of the marbles' return. Merriman accepts that Elgin bribed the Ottomans in order to obtain the necessary permission with numerous gifts in both Athens and Constantinople, and Merriman mentions that some of the gifts were given with full transparency and were thus legal according to the then applicable law, whilst others were given under the table in order to secure a more favorable treatment which he would not otherwise have. This fact has been corroborated also by the author Sinclair in his book Lord Elgin and the Marbles. Of course, Merriman concludes that these multiple bribes, which he considers to be indisputable, are not of a significant legal consideration because the permissions of the Ottoman authorities were, to his opinion, legal, irrespective of their motives since they were later ratified. However, Merriman's position is inadmissible. The main and simple reason is that several years after the publication of his paper, of Merriman's paper, the Proceeds of Crime Act has came into force in the UK. According to this act, bribery is one of the acts on which the legalization of property from criminal activity is predicated, and therefore the proceeds of a bribery are the proceeds of a crime. Bribery, which was in most cases conceived as passive bribery, has been a punishable act in England for centuries and was usually confused and conflated with the crime of blackmail. Hence, the state official who demanded a material benefit by blackmailing in order to perform an act that was part of his duty was punished. In this context, Judge Noonan mentions the case of Warren Hastings, governor of the British colony of Bengali in India, as the first indisputable case of bribery in the modern sense, which occurred in 1800, that is 12 years before the looting of the marbles by Elgin. This is particularly important because it means that already at the time of the marbles removal, the act of bribery was punishable under English law. Further laws on bribery existed in England since ancient times. I mention the first statute of Westminster, the fundamental law on extortion, in force between 1275 and 1968. We may safely deduce from the above that during the removal of the marbles, an act of bribery took place, in the sense the term had in England, in English law that time, by an English state official, since in addition to the gifts given with transparency, further gifts were given which were undoubtedly and directly related with overcoming the Ottoman opposition to the removal of the marbles. Yes. Further, 1 minute, yes, sure. We may infer from the Hastings case that, first, the act of bribery was punishable even if it was committed abroad, and second, that even if we accept that the provisions we mentioned refer to passive than to active bribery, in this particular case, the punishability is in accordance with English law because, first, Elgin active bribery constituted also an act of participation in passive bribery, and second, the marbles remain the proceeds of crime originating in passive bribery of the Ottoman authorities. And finally, according to the Proceeds of Crime Act of now in force in the UK, every crime and therefore bribery is considered to be a predicate crime for establishing laundering. If the predicate crime was committed abroad, the punishability of laundering is not affected. It is inconsequential whether the criminal act took place before the law came into force, since it is sufficient that the legalization was committed according to the existing law. And finally, all benefits resulting directly or indirectly from criminal conduct is regarded as property, irrespective if it was movable or immovable, material or intangible. And the most important, an act of legalization is deemed to consist not only in the use of the criminal property, but also, I quote, in the mere passive possession of that property. From the above, it may be inferred that even if the possession of the marble is not subject to the Proceeds of Crime Act, it is in any case tainted with a moral stigma which alludes to the German theory of stigma, the Makel theory, according to which any object that originates in a criminal act has reduced value, even if, according to civil law, the acquirer is obtaining ownership. And a final remark. We nurture no illusions. The matter of the return of the marbles is principally political. However, if we wish to be members of a cultural family that takes law seriously, the principles and the rules of domestic and international law must be applied uniformly for all. They must not be applied selectively and for a few. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Milanopoulos, for your remarks, extremely useful in our times. We can have the little discussion or questions at the end, so we proceed from Alexandria to Venice with our Alexandrian colleague, friend and sister, Professor Maltesu.
The medieval man construed the stealing of holy relics as a pious act pleasing to God, since their ownership strengthened his faith and their possession acted as a shield against evil. Hence, the practice of stealing holy relics, the so-called translationes, was treated as sacred theft, furta sacra, and the removal of the relic from its original location was ideologically vindicated each time with the aid of the appropriate interpretative tools. Early on, the holy relics of saints and their collection had aroused the interest of the Venetians, not only because they were regarded priceless evidence of Christian piety, but rather because they served as means of political propaganda, the political aspirations of the Serenissima. According to the Venetian propaganda, the theft of the relic of the saint, who is believed to have preached the gospel in the Venetian lagoon on his way to Aquileia, was a divine mission, since the relics of saints had to be safeguarded in secure localities owned by genuine Christians and not faithless Muslims or schismatics. From then on, the story is familiar. In 828, two Venetian merchants stole the body and justified their deed on the grounds that Alexandria and the entire Egypt had been seized by the Saracens. Therefore, the relic had to be transferred from a land governed by the perfidious to a Christian territory. Aided by the Greek guards of the church, they placed the relic into a basket concealed beneath vegetables and pork, since the sight of the meat would keep the Muslims away, and after they secretly switched the body with that of Saint Claudia, they managed to move the container to their vessel and transfer it from Alexandria to Venice. With the translatio of the relic of St. Mark to the city of the Doges, the two worlds of Alexandria and Venice, despite the relatively large geographical distance separating them, were curiously linked with each other, and the bonds that were established have left their remembrances on cultural treasures preserved in the Serenissima. These remembrances I will attempt to present in this brief paper. In the representation of scenes from the life of St. Mark, and particularly the episode of the translation of his relic, which is preserved in the Basilica of St. Mark in Venice, Alexandria, with its landmark, the Pharos, occupies a central position. Classified as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Pharos of Alexandria dates back to that glorious era of Hellenism during which the Greek language was spoken ubiquitously, carried as far as Bactria, as far as the Indians, to recite the famous verse, by the Alexandrian poets. According to traveling and chronographic sources, during the Middle Ages, possibly in the late 11th century, a kuba, namely a dome with gallery, was added to the pharos that signified its conversion into a mosque. It appears that the monument with the dome was known to the pilgrims of the Holy Land, and based on their accounts, the architectural shape had possibly spread to the west, as evidenced by the depictions of the pharos with the kuba at the Basilica of St. Mark. The topographical emblem of Alexandria is illustrated on a mosaic of the Church of St. Mark that dates from the 12th century and depicts the martyrdom of the saint. Η πρώτη διαφάνεια σας παρακαλώ. The saint was tied with ropes by the pagans and was dragged and pilloried through the streets of Alexandria until he died of his injuries. In the representation, the pharos with the dome is shown behind the figure of the saint. With red color at the top of the building indicate the light that burned and lightened the surrounding area at night is depicted the pharos included in the later mosaic beneath the Ascension Dome. The pharos is illustrated at the side of the saint, who is portrayed writing his gospel. To the following 13th century dates the mosaic that occupies the presbytery of the church and depicts the translation of the relic, but instead of the pharos, Alexandria is schematically indicated by a gate with two turrets on either side, with the inscription Alexandria written in majuscule letters in the center. You can see the two Venetian merchants, Tribunus and Rusticus, and the two Greek Orthodox monks, Theodoros and Stavrakios, carrying the relic. Another mosaic, which is preserved in the Zen chapel of the Basilica of St. Mark, with the representation of the pharos, dates also to 13th century. The mosaic illustrates the arrival from Alexandria in Venice of the vessel that carried St. Mark. The pharos is shown in the center with a flight of stairs that reach the sea, whereas to the left is depicted the boat with the Venetian merchants lowering the sails as their vessel had already entered the port, and to the right the saint is pictured healing the cobbler Anianus. Alexandria is indicated by arches and the majuscule inscription Alessandria. The pharos is also depicted with stairs reaching down to the sea on a mosaic of the chapel of St. Isidore, in which the journey of the saint from Alexandria to the island of Chios unfolds, with Alexandria being suggested by its symbol, the pharos. Another mosaic representation of the pharos, which is not preserved today, that originally embellished the facade of the Church of St. Mark, can be discerned on a painting by Gentile Bellini dating from the 15th century, kept at the Galleria dell'Accademia. In Bellini's painting, Processione di Santa Croce, the pharos is shown as the landmark of Alexandria, between the boat that translated the relic and Muslims that converse with the merchants on the coast. The pharos takes the form of an, here is the, you can see here and here. The pharos takes the form of an obelisk in the Pala Feriale painting signed by Paolo Veneziano and Sons, an exquisite work of Venetian art dating to 1345, held at St. Mark's Museum. The scene depicts St. Mark healing the cobbler Anianus. Before the imposing pharos, Christ is shown standing next to the seated figures of the saint and Anianus. Finally, in later periods, particularly during the Renaissance, the iconography of the pharos takes imaginary forms depending each time on the disposition of the artist. These cases include a tapestry, the so-called arazzo, of the mid-16th century that belongs to the collection of tapestries on display at St. Mark's Museum. The work, based on the design by a Flemish master who worked in Florence that was governed at the time by the Medici, illustrates a scene from the cycle of the miracles of St. Mark in which he liberates a possessed man. The saint and the possessed man. The pharos is noticed in the background, here, near the sea, behind the figure of the saint, taking an unrealistic architectural form since it comprises two cylindrical structures, the one on the top of the other. However, the connection that was established between the Venetians and the seventh wonder of the ancient world is not limited to these depictions. In 1909, the German archaeologist Hermann Thiersch, in his treatise on the pharos, maintains that the architectural form of the famous campanile at St. Mark's Square in its original phase had been influenced by the shape of the pharos, as though it continued to silently defend the sacred relic of the saint with its presence. These are the drawings by Thiersch, and here the campanile of St. Mark, and here the photograph of the campanile and the drawing of Thiersch. Apart from the representations of the pharos, references to the city of Alexandria and its founder are encountered in various cultural treasures of Venice, preserved in its libraries and the renowned state archives of the city, one of the most significant archival depositories in Europe. Among the printed and archival treasures, 2 maps of Alexandria and 2 documents are notable. The first map comes from the 6-volume Terrarum Orbis Civitates, dating from 1597, held today at the Venetian monastery of San Francesco della Vigna. Alexandria is depicted as a major commercial center of Egypt with its old and new harbor, its squares, dwellings, and monuments, including the Church of St. Mark. Here. The second representation of the harbor of Alexandria is a drawing that dates back to the 18th century, kept at the Museo Correr. The fort of Kite Bay that was built over the ruins of the pharos is visible. Noteworthy archival evidence safeguarded at the State Archives of Venice includes 9 documents concerning Michaletos Papadopoulos of Crete, who had engaged in commercial activities in Egypt during the early decades of the 15th century. Here is the name, Michaleto Papadopoulos, and here is Alexandria. Interesting archival testimonies to the presence and the activity of the Cretan entrepreneur in the land of the Nile are contained in the published letters which he had sent in 1419 from Damietta to the Venetian consul in Alexandria, with which he reported on the moves of the despot Theodore Palaiologos in the Peloponnese. I will conclude this brief paper on the cultural assets in Venice that pertain to Alexandria, referring to 2 more invaluable treasures which are associated with Alexander, the founder of the city. The first is the relief that has been embedded into the wall of the north side of the Basilica of St. Mark, and the second is the illuminated manuscript of the 14th century, the so-called Romance of Alexander, attributed to Pseudo-Callisthenes, which is kept at the Hellenic Institute of Byzantine and Post-Byzantine Studies. Brought to Venice from Constantinople as spoil of the Fourth Crusade, the relief set into the external side of the Basilica of St. Mark depicts the ascension of Alexander the Great, a representation that in the mentality of the Byzantines is entwined with imperial ideology. Alexander, having supernatural powers, aspiring to conquer the kingdom of heaven, is depicted idealized as an instigator and creator of world hegemony. On the relief, he is portrayed as a Byzantine emperor wearing the laurus crossed over his chest and hemispherical crown, standing on his chariot, which is schematically rendered. He is flanked by two griffins, while he holds in his hands paws ending in vultures. A second valuable relic, the Romance of Alexander, consists of fictionary stories of the adventurous life of the Macedonian ruler and is decorated with 250 ornate miniature paintings, most of which cover the whole surface of the page with numerous Western and Eastern elements, showing Alexander as Byzantine emperor. You can see Alexander as Byzantine emperor. And here you see the miniature that illustrates the foundation of Alexandria. The Romance of Alexander was particularly widespread during the Middle Ages and was translated into many languages: Latin, Syriac, Armenian, Serbian, Ethiopian, etc. In 1529, the story of Alexander the Great, in verse version, known as Rimada, was first printed in Venice, edited by Demetrio Zeno, whereas the popular book, written in vernacular language and in prose, exerted great influence on the populace, as it was published in 60 editions and was read by many generations of Greeks during the Ottoman occupation. It is obvious that the printed book has largely contributed to the cultivation of the notion of the ecumenical character of Alexander, and also that Venice, with its printers, particularly the Greek ones, played a decisive role in the propagation of this ideology. Thank you.